Lydia watched in a trance as her mother-in-law's designer heels crunched over the charcoal sketches scattered across the porch. 6 months of work now smeared with trash and rainwater. Inside, the golden anniversary candles she'd lit an hour ago were being snuffed out one by one, replaced by the clinical, suffocating scent of Evelyn's aggressive perfume. When Lydia turned to her husband for help, Marcus didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he stepped into the shadows behind his mother, his face a cold, unrecognizable mask of compliance. The silence in the kitchen was broken only by the rhythmic, metallic scrape of Evelyn's key. A key Lydia never knew existed, sliding across the granite countertop. As Evelyn began systematically tossing Lydia's personal belongings into a heavy black trash bag, Marcus reached for his phone and calmly hit "Confirm" on a banking app, his eyes avoiding his wife's desperate gaze. Lydia felt the floor tilt beneath her. The locks had been changed, the accounts were draining, and the 2 people she trusted most were standing in her kitchen, treating her like a trespasser in her own life. The screen door groaned on its hinges as Marcus stepped inside, his boots leaving damp prints on the welcome mat. He didn't bother wiping them, never did. Just tossed his keys onto the side table where they skittered against the ceramic bowl of potpourri. The scent of cloves and dried orange peel rose in the disturbed air, sharp enough to cut through the buttery richness of the kitchen. Lydia didn't turn. Her fingers stilled over the last unlit candle, the wick still pristine, untouched by flame. The wax smelled faintly of beeswax and something older, like the inside of a church. She exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, before striking the match. The sulfur flared, bright and brief, then settled into a steady glow. "You're late," she said. Not a reproach, just fact. The words hung between them, soft as the steam curling from the pot of gravy on the stove. Marcus grunted, shrugging out of his jacket. The fabric was stiff with dried mud, the elbows worn thin. He draped it over the back of a chair, where it sagged like a discarded skin. Traffic on 85. Some idiot flipped his truck near the exit. She didn't ask if he was hurt. She never did. Instead, she reached for the carving knife, testing its edge with her thumb. The blade caught the light, a thin silver line. "Dinner's ready." He pulled out a chair, the legs scraping against the hardwood. The sound made her teeth ache. "Smells good," he said. But his eyes were on the window, on the darkening yard beyond. The last of the daylight bled through the trees, turning the grass the color of old bruises. Lydia pressed the knife into the meat. The flesh parted easily, pink and glistening. She didn't look up. "You should wash your hands." The domestic rhythm of the evening felt fragile, a thin glaze over a cooling dish. Lydia smoothed the white linen tablecloth, her palms tracing the grain of the oak beneath as if searching for a pulse in the wood. This was their 10th anniversary, a decade of shared breaths and silent compromises. In the air of their Atlanta suburb, the scent of rosemary rubbed turkey and tart cranberries swirled, thick enough to taste. She had spent hours preparing, hanging gold-flecked garlands that chimed softly against the crown molding, a delicate glass music that filled the gaps in their conversation. On the mantel, 10 slender beeswax tapers stood in a row, pale sentinels of the years they had survived. Her fingers still carried the sting of lemon zest and cinnamon, a sensory map of the day's labor. She adjusted the hem of her silk dress, the fabric cool against her skin, and watched the clock. The ticking seemed to synchronize with the thrum of her own blood. When the tires finally crunched on the gravel driveway, the sound brought a fleeting smile to her lips. But it vanished the moment Marcus crossed the threshold. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the table. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the Persian rug, a violation of the orders she had painstakingly restored, and began to pace. His shoulders were hunched, a defensive posture he adopted when the world outside became too heavy to carry. Lydia stepped toward him, arms opening for the customary embrace, but he pivoted away, feigning an intense interest in his shoelaces. The air between them grew brittle. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous, repetitive motion that signaled a mind already elsewhere. The anxiety began to coil in her stomach, a greasy, cold thing that ignored the warmth of the hearth. The silence was not the companionable kind they usually shared. It was jagged. Marcus reached for a glass of wine, his hand trembling slightly. But before the crystal could touch his lips, a harsh, metallic screech tore through the house. The sound of a key turning in a lock that should have been deadbolted. The front door swung wide, hitting the stopper with a dull thud, and Evelyn swept in. She didn't knock. She never did. The woman carried the atmosphere of the house like a conquered territory, her own set of keys jingling with a triumphant, rhythmic spite. Marcus straightened instantly, his spine clicking into a military posture that made Lydia's heart sink. It was as if a string had been pulled, connecting his vertebrae to his mother's whims. Evelyn kicked off her shoes in the middle of the hallway, expensive, pointed things that looked like weapons, and marched toward them. The delicate aroma of rosemary and slow-cooked bird was instantly smothered by Evelyn's perfume, a suffocating cloud of heavy powder and aggressive musk that clung to the back of Lydia's throat. "You're burning the bird, Lydia," Evelyn announced, bypassing any greeting. She didn't wait for a response before invading the kitchen. She nudged Lydia aside with a sharp elbow, a movement so practiced it felt casual. The lid of the sauté pan came off with a clatter, and Evelyn leaned into the steam, her face contorting into a mask of theatrical disgust. She grabbed a spoon, tasted the sauce, and immediately spat it into the sink with a wet, visceral sound. Too much salt. Honestly, do you want him to have a stroke before he's 50? Evelyn began pulling containers from her designer bag, pale, lifeless stalks of steamed broccoli and tubs of chalky curd. She moved with a frenetic, colonizing energy, turning off the oven and effectively killing the heat for the centerpiece of the meal. She took an antiseptic wipe and began to scrub the granite counters, moving in circles that seemed designed to erase any evidence that Lydia had ever touched the surface. Lydia gripped the edge of the island, her short-trimmed nails digging into the stone until her fingertips turned white. The rage was a slow-rising tide, hot and salty. "Evelyn, please. This was supposed to be our night. I've spent all day." "You've spent all day making him fat and sluggish," Evelyn countered, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. Lydia turned to Marcus, her eyes pleading for a boundary, a single word of solidarity. But Marcus stepped forward and placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder. His palm was cold, heavy as lead. "Don't make a scene, Lyd," he whispered, his breath smelling of the wine he'd barely tasted. "She's just looking out for me. Let her stay. It's just dinner." He took the oven mitts from Lydia's hand and gave them to his mother. A silent surrender of the domestic crown. Evelyn's chin tilted up, a predator sensing the exact moment the prey stopped struggling. The invasion didn't stop at the kitchen. Evelyn drifted into the living room, her eyes darting like a hawk's over every piece of furniture Lydia had carefully curated. She grabbed the corner of the velvet armchair, a piece Lydia had saved for months to buy, and shoved it toward the window with a gut-wrenching scrape against the hardwood. "The flow is all wrong. It looks like a lobby in a third-rate motel," Evelyn remarked. She began stripping the decorative pillows from the sofa, the ones Lydia had hand-embroidered during the long winter evenings. They were tossed into a corner, like discarded rags. Marcus stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face a blank slate of complicity. Lydia watched the labor of her hands, the physical manifestations of her taste and identity, being dismantled and piled into a heap of perceived inadequacy. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the smell of Evelyn's powder and the underlying scent of Marcus's silent withdrawal. Lydia slipped out the back door, needing the bite of the evening air to clear the fog of humiliation. She leaned against the siding, her breath coming in shallow gasps, until her gaze fell on the large plastic trash bin near the garage. Something was wrong. The lid wasn't flush. She reached out, her hand trembling, and lifted the heavy plastic. There, resting atop coffee grounds and wet eggshells, were the torn remnants of her life. Thick, high-grade paper, jaggedly ripped. She recognized the charcoal lines, the study of light hitting the Georgia oaks, the series of portraits she had been perfecting for 6 months. Her work, her soul. Evelyn appeared on the porch, drying her hands on a kitchen towel as if she hadn't just committed a murder. "I cleared out that cluttered little room of yours," she said, her voice airy, detached. "It was full of such grim little things. You need a proper guest room, Lydia. Something useful." Lydia pulled a crumpled sketch from the muck, a portrait of Marcus that was now stained with brown liquid and filth. The scream stayed lodged in her throat, a jagged stone she couldn't swallow. "You threw them away? You went into my studio and threw away my work?" Evelyn shrugged, the movement elegant and dismissive. "It's just paper, dear. A hobby. You should focus on something productive, like the pantry. It's a disgrace in there." Lydia didn't think. She moved. She threw the ruined sketches onto the porch floor and stepped into Evelyn's personal space, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You have no right. You don't get to touch my things. You don't get to decide what my life is worth." Her voice broke, rising into a jagged cry that echoed off the neighboring houses. Evelyn didn't flinch. She curled her lip into a cold, practiced sneer. "Worth? You haven't brought a cent into this house in 3 years, Lydia. You play with your paints while my son kills himself at the firm to pay for this roof. It's pathetic." The sound of the screen door slamming announced Marcus's arrival. He didn't look at the ruined art on the floor. He looked at Lydia's red face, at her shaking hands. He winced, a visible recoiling from her emotion. "Lydia, stop it. You're being hysterical." Evelyn immediately pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and rhythmic. She leaned toward Marcus, the picture of a fragile woman besieged by a madwoman. Marcus took a step toward his mother, his back turning to his wife. The betrayal was a physical weight, a coldness that seeped into Lydia's bones. She retreated. There was no winning a fight where the judge was in the pocket of the defendant. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, her movements mechanical, her mind a white noise of shock. She needed to see something real. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her thumb hovering over the banking app. She needed to buy more supplies, new paper, new charcoal, to replace what had been desecrated. She needed to feel like she still had a stake in her own world. The app opened with a familiar chime. She tapped the joint savings account, the one they called the Dream House Fund. It was supposed to hold nearly $80,000, the fruit of a decade of saving, of her old teaching salary, of his bonuses. The balance was $412. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging beneath her. She scrolled through the transaction history, her eyes blurring. 2 days ago, $25,000 transfer. Yesterday, $30,000. Today, $20,000. The recipient name was a repetitive drumbeat against her skull. Evelyn Freeman. Evelyn Freeman. Evelyn Freeman. The house was silent below, save for the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of a teacup. They were down there, celebrating her erasure. Lydia stood up, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She gripped the phone so hard the casing groaned. When she reached the dining room, she didn't wait for a pause in their conversation. She thrust the screen into Marcus's face, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Explain this. Now." Marcus didn't jump. He didn't even look surprised. He slowly set down his fork and exchanged a brief, knowing glance with his mother. "Lydia, sit down. You're overreacting." "Overreacting? Our savings are gone, Marcus. You gave her everything we worked for." "I gave my mother access to her family's resources," Marcus said, his voice dropping into that corporate register he used to settle disputes. "She needs to renovate the estate, and her medical bills are mounting. It's my responsibility. I'm her son." Evelyn took a slow, delicate sip of tea, her eyes watching Lydia over the rim of the cup with a terrifying, placid satisfaction. "It's just money, Lydia," she said softly. "Don't be so common." "It's our money," Lydia screamed, the word tearing at her throat. "It's the money I saved from teaching. It's the money we were going to use for our future." Marcus stood up then, looming over her. The man she had married was gone, replaced by a stone-faced stranger who looked exactly like the woman sitting at the head of the table. "It's my income that sustains this lifestyle, Lydia. You've been a guest here for years. If I choose to support my mother, that is my prerogative. You're being incredibly selfish and mercenary. It's embarrassing." He looked at her with a profound, icy disdain. Evelyn nodded in agreement, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a silk napkin. "Family comes first, dear. Perhaps if you understood that, you wouldn't be so upset over a few numbers." Marcus sat back down and smiled at his mother. A warm, genuine expression he hadn't offered Lydia in months. Evelyn began to pour more tea from the family's silver service, assuming the position at the head of the table where Lydia always sat. Lydia stood in the shadows of the doorway, a ghost in her own home, watching them weave a world that no longer had a place for her. The following weeks were a slow-motion car crash, a series of calculated humiliations that felt like sandpaper against an open wound. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a stage for Evelyn's grand productions. One morning, Lydia walked into the kitchen to find the air thick with the smell of expensive tobacco and a perfume that wasn't hers. By the window, framed by the morning light, stood Rebecca. She was winding a copper-red lock of hair around her finger, laughing at something Marcus had said. She was wearing a silk robe, a delicate champagne-colored thing that looked identical to the one Marcus had given Lydia for their anniversary. Evelyn was there too, playing the doting hostess, pouring orange juice for the woman who had been Marcus's "the one that got away" before Lydia ever entered the picture. "Oh, Lydia, you're up," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine warmth. "Rebecca stopped by to help us plan the charity gala. Since you're usually so busy with your sketches, I thought a fresh perspective would be helpful." Rebecca turned, her smile brilliant and utterly devoid of warmth. "Lydia, it's been ages. Marcus was just telling me how much he misses the old days." She stepped closer to Marcus, her knee brushing his thigh with a casual, practiced intimacy. Marcus didn't pull away. He didn't even look up from his omelet. Evelyn pulled out the heavy oak chair to Marcus's right, Lydia's chair, and patted the seat. "Sit, Rebecca. You must try these croissants." Lydia moved toward her usual spot, but Evelyn's hand shot out, blocking her path. She pointed with her chin toward a small, rickety stool near the laundry room door, far from the circle of light at the main table. You can sit there, dear. We need the space for the blueprints. Lydia sat. She sat in the shadows, watching them through a forest of tall silver candlesticks and overflowing fruit bowls. She listened to them talk about trips to Cabo, about shared secrets she wasn't part of, about a life that was being reconstructed right in front of her. Marcus's laughter was easy, a sound she realized she hadn't heard directed at her in years. When she finally retreated to her studio, seeking the only solace she had left, the smell hit her first. It wasn't the clean tang of linseed oil or the earthy scent of charcoal. It was dust. Old, heavy, suffocating dust. She flicked the switch, but the bright LED panels she'd installed for detail work remained dark. In their place, heavy velvet curtains the color of dried blood had been draped over the windows, held up by crude staples. The room was a tomb. Her brushes, her canvases, her life's work had been shoveled into corners to make room for stacks of leather-bound encyclopedias and moth-eaten rugs. Evelyn was in the corner, a staple gun in her hand. Thwack. She drove another metal tooth into the window frame, sealing out the sun. This room has much better light for a library, Evelyn said, not looking at her. Art is all well and good, but a house of this stature needs intellectual weight. Lydia's hands began to shake. She reached for her phone, needing to see her schedule, needing to see the date for her upcoming masterclass at the academy. It was the only thing she had left that was hers alone. A notification was waiting. Subject: enrollment cancellation. Academy of Fine Arts. Dear Ms. Freeman, we regret to inform you that your registration for the portraiture masterclass has been canceled due to insufficient funds. The bank notified us that the payment was recalled by the account holder. Lydia looked up. Evelyn was standing by the window, slowly rubbing her thumb over the edge of a black titanium credit card. She met Lydia's gaze with the flat, unblinking stare of a shark. Did you do this? Lydia's voice was a whisper, a thread of sound. I'm simply tightening the belt, Lydia. Marcus agrees that luxury expenditures are inappropriate given the current economic climate. If you want to paint, there are plenty of crayons in the junk drawer. The blood in Lydia's veins turned to ice. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked out of the room, her footsteps silent on the rug. She found Marcus in the dining room, where Evelyn had already spread out a series of legal documents. Marcus, look at me, Lydia commanded. He looked up, but his eyes were clouded, distant. Evelyn was leaning over him, her voice a rhythmic, hypnotic purr. It's for the best, Marcus. With Lydia's recent instability, the property needs to be in a secure trust. For your protection. She slid a fountain pen across the table. The scratch of the nib against the heavy bond paper sounded like a bone snapping. Marcus signed. He didn't even read the paragraph that effectively signed over his portion of the house to a trust managed solely by his mother. Lydia felt the trap snap shut. Her money was gone. Her work was destroyed. Her husband was a puppet. And now, the very roof over her head belonged to the woman who wanted her dead. The escalation was surgical. Lydia found herself a prisoner in a house she no longer owned, surrounded by people who treated her like a difficult tenant. She decided to confront Evelyn in her own territory, the master bedroom, where the woman had set up a secondary command center. Lydia burst in without knocking. Evelyn was at her vanity, surrounded by crystal bottles of perfume that smelled like a funeral home. On the marble top lay a stack of receipts, the evidence of the academy payment being clawed back. Lydia lunged for them. Give me those. I'm calling the bank. Evelyn was faster. Her hand, thin and dry as parchment, snatched the papers away. She pivoted to the wall, where a heavy steel safe was hidden behind a painting of a fox hunt. With a series of precise clicks, she locked the documents away. "Give me the key, Evelyn," Lydia demanded, her voice shaking with a rage she could no longer contain. Evelyn turned, her face a mask of aristocratic boredom. She tucked the silver key into the deep pocket of her cardigan. "You're making a scene, Lydia. It's so beneath you." Lydia reached out, her fingers catching the wool of Evelyn's sleeve. She just wanted to pull her away from the safe, to make her look at the wreckage she'd caused. But the moment her skin touched Evelyn's, the older woman's eyes flashed with a terrifying, predatory light. Evelyn grabbed Lydia's wrists. Her grip was shockingly strong, her nails digging into Lydia's skin like talons. Lydia gasped, trying to pull back, but Evelyn held on, her face inches away. Then, with a sudden, violent grace, Evelyn let go and threw herself backward. She hit a pedestal holding a tall Ming-style vase. The porcelain shattered with a sound like a gunshot, thousands of razor-sharp shards erupting across the floor. One piece caught Evelyn's cheek, leaving a thin, bright, red line of blood. Evelyn didn't move. She looked at the blood on her fingers, then reached up and ripped the top button off her silk blouse. She looked at Lydia, and for a second, a genuine smile touched her lips. Then she started to scream. It was a hollow, haunting sound, a series of ragged sobs that filled the room. She collapsed onto the floor, right into the field of broken porcelain, her body racking with simulated tremors. "Help! Marcus, help! She's hurting me!" Lydia stood frozen, her hands still raised in the air. The sound of heavy footsteps thundered on the stairs. Marcus burst through the door, his face pale with terror. He saw his mother on the ground, bleeding, surrounded by the ruins of her favorite vase. He saw Lydia standing over her. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look for a second side to the story. He lunged past Lydia, nearly knocking her over, and gathered Evelyn into his arms. "She tried to kill me, Marcus," Evelyn wailed, her voice a thin, pathetic reed. "She wanted the key. She just started breaking things." Marcus looked at Lydia, and the expression in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Get out," he hissed. "Get out of this room before I call the police." Lydia backed away, her heart hammering against her teeth. She watched Evelyn bury her face in Marcus's neck, the woman's eyes meeting Lydia's over his shoulder. There were no tears in those eyes, only the cold, dead victory of a queen who had just removed the final obstacle to her throne. The days leading up to Thanksgiving were a blur of cold rain and suffocating silence. Lydia moved through the house like a wraith, her presence ignored by Marcus and actively mocked by Evelyn. The older woman had taken over the kitchen entirely, preparing for the holiday with a grim, military efficiency. Lydia found herself drawn to the trash again, a morbid habit born of the need to know what else had been taken from her. In the bin behind the garage, she found a discarded legal envelope. The rain had dampened the paper, making it translucent. Subject: Petition for involuntary guardianship. Evidence of recurring cognitive instability. Risk to personal and marital assets. Evelyn Freeman to be named sole conservator. The breath left Lydia's lungs in a cold rush. They weren't just taking her money. They were going to take her mind. They were going to have her declared incompetent, a legal ghost who couldn't own property, couldn't sign a contract, couldn't leave. She walked back into the house, her boots heavy with mud. In her studio, her library, she found Rebecca and Evelyn. They were packing boxes. Lydia saw her wedding album being tossed into a crate marked storage. She saw her hand-sewn scarves being used as packing material for Evelyn's crystal. Marcus was there too, sitting in a chair by the window. He was staring at nothing. "Marcus?" Lydia said. He didn't turn. "We're moving, Marcus," Evelyn said, her voice bright and brittle. "I've booked you a suite at the Riviera. You need a break from this atmosphere. And then we'll all move into the estate together. It's a much more stable environment." She patted Marcus's cheek, a gesture so patronizing it made Lydia's skin crawl. Marcus took the key card she offered him like a child taking a piece of candy. Lydia realized then that she was out of time. She couldn't fight them with words. She couldn't fight them with tears. She had to fight them with the only thing they respected: leverage. That night, she moved with the silence of a shadow. She had spent the last of her hidden cash, money she'd tucked away in an old paint can, on a set of tiny, high-definition cameras and microphones. She installed them with the precision of a surgeon, one behind the vent in the living room, one in the folds of the curtains, one in the study. She watched the feed on her phone from the darkness of the guest room. She saw Evelyn and Marcus in the study. She heard the she list of paper. "It's just a formality, Marcus." Evelyn's voice came through the speaker, crisp and cold. "A general power of attorney. It protects your earnings from any potential divorce settlements Lydia might try to initiate. You know how she is. She's looking for a payout." Marcus sighed. It was the sound of a man who had given up. "Whatever you think is best, Mother." The sound of the stamp hitting the paper was a death knell. Lydia waited. She waited until the house was full of the extended family, the aunts, the cousins, the people who provided the audience for Evelyn's performance of the perfect matriarch. She waited until the smell of turkey filled the halls, a thick, cloying scent that felt like a shroud. She slipped into Evelyn's room while the family was distracted by appetizers. The woman's cardigan was on the bed. Lydia's fingers found the heavy silver key. Her heart was a drum in her ears, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that threatened to choke her. She opened the safe. She didn't find medical bills. She didn't find investment portfolios. She found a stack of receipts from a casino in Atlantic City. Tens of thousands of dollars, all spent in the last month. And with them, a series of photographs. Evelyn, looking 20 years younger, laughing in the arms of a tanned, handsome man who definitely wasn't her late husband. "To my darling Evelyn." The note on the back of one photo read, "The investment from your son arrived. The villa in St. Kitts is waiting. Your useful idiot really is a gold mine." Lydia's hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone as she photographed every page. The Yarist was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. Marcus wasn't just being manipulated. He was being robbed to fund a secret life of gambling and a gigolo. She heard a noise on the patio. She moved to the window, keeping the phone recording. Evelyn was outside, smoking a thin cigarette. She was on the phone. "Oh, he's fine," she laughed, a harsh, braying sound. "He's a spineless little purse, really. I tell him I'm sick, and he opens the vault. We'll be on the beach by Christmas, and the little painter girl will be in a state facility where she belongs." Lydia backed away from the window. She had it. She had everything. The dinner was a masterclass in tension. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, resplendent in indigo silk, holding court. She had placed Rebecca next to Marcus and relegated Lydia to the very end of the table, near the swinging door to the kitchen. "I have an announcement," Marcus said, standing up and tapping his glass. The room went silent. "This will be our last Thanksgiving in this house. I've decided to sell. Mother and I feel it's time for a fresh start, closer to our roots." The aunts murmured their approval. Evelyn beamed, her hand resting over Marcus's like a brand. Lydia stood up. She didn't have a turkey. She had a stack of glossy, high-resolution prints. "I have an announcement, too," Lydia said. Her voice was steady, a calm center in the storm of her own making. She walked around the table, placing a packet in front of every guest. She placed one in front of the aunt, who always criticized her, one in front of the cousin who ignored her, and finally, one in front of Marcus. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. Marcus looked at the photo of his mother at the craps table. He looked at the receipts for the St. Kitts villa. He looked at the transcript of the useful idiot phone call. Lydia reached into her pocket and pressed a button on her phone. Evelyn's voice filled the room, amplified by the house's built-in speakers. "He's a spineless little purse, really. We'll be on the beach by Christmas." Evelyn's face went from pale to a terrifying, mottled purple. She clutched the table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She started to slide toward the floor, her eyes rolling back. "Help! My heart!" she wheezed. Lydia didn't move. She didn't even blink. "Call 911, Marcus," she said, her voice like ice. "Tell them we need an ambulance for a heart attack and the police for a fraud investigation. I'm sure the paramedics will want to see those medical bills she's been paying." Evelyn froze. The attack stopped as if a switch had been flipped. She sat up, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, concentrated venom. "You little bitch," she hissed. The room erupted. The aunts were screaming, the cousins were grabbing for the papers, and Marcus just looked at his mother. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time in 40 years. He reached out and snatched the keys to the house from Evelyn's hand. "Out," he said. The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a mountain. "Marcus, darling, she's lying. She's out!" Marcus roared, the sound shaking the glass in the cabinets. "Take Rebecca and get out before I let her call the police." Lydia watched them go. She watched the woman who had tried to erase her scurry into the night, her silk dress catching on the doorframe. She heard the tires scream on the gravel, a sound of finality. The house was empty now, save for the wreckage of a dinner that would never be finished. Marcus was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. Lydia didn't go to him. She didn't offer comfort. She went to her studio. She sat at her computer and opened the application for the Paris residency. The one Evelyn had told her she was too untalented to even consider. She uploaded her portfolio. She hit send. Then she printed out a second set of documents. She walked back into the dining room and placed them in front of Marcus. "What's this?" he asked, his voice broken. "A post-nuptial agreement," Lydia said. "It restores my access to the accounts, places the house in my name only, and sets a very clear boundary regarding your mother. If you don't sign it, the next packet I hand out will be to a divorce attorney, and the one after that will be to the district attorney regarding the investment fraud." Marcus looked at her. He saw the woman who had survived him. He saw the artist who had been willing to burn down her own life to save her soul. He signed. Lydia walked out onto the porch. The sun was beginning to rise over the Georgia oaks, a pale serenity light that washed over the yard. The air was cold and clean, free of the scent of powder and betrayal. She leaned against the railing and took a breath, a deep, full breath that reached all the way to the bottom of her lungs. She wasn't just a wife. She wasn't just a guest. She was Lydia Freeman, and for the first time in 10 years, she was finally home.